Imagine working with a personal trainer who coaches you in self-compassion as well as your squat technique. Imagine turning up at football training and being encouraged to express appreciation as well as expressing sweat. Imagine that you're recovering from an injury and your physiotherapist encourages you to cultivate your character strengths in order to succeed in your rehab goals. I have a dream that wherever we go to exercise our bodies, we're also actively encouraged to exercise our minds. 12 years ago, I was sitting on the edge of my bed, staring into my wardrobe. I just couldn't decide what I was going to wear that day. How many of you here have had that experience of feeling so drained you just couldn't make a decision? Raise your hand. Yeah, pretty common, right? Now, the problem for me on that day was that I had already been staring into my wardrobe for 2 hours. I was beyond drained. I was depressed. And my depression had progressed to the point where I was not functioning. This was my life in 2007. Fast forward to 2017. I had just taken a psychological health questionnaire and found that my scores put me in the top bracket of functioning and well-being. Now, for somebody who had had an eating disorder at 13, severe depression by age 17, and a diagnosis of bipolar disorder at 23, this was something to celebrate, particularly because the shift for me from mental illness to mental fitness has been no accident. The likelihood here is that almost half of us in the room are going to experience a mental illness in our lifetime. This year alone, 1 in 5 of us will experience an episode of mental illness. The 4 of you here, you might be okay, statistically, because I've already had my episode this year, which I say jokingly, but that's true. That's been my experience. And I consider myself to be mentally fit. But just like with our physical fitness, even the fittest among us will still get sick from time to time. The question is, what are the mental exercises that we can do to make ourselves more robust so that we recover more quickly and get sick less often? Now, first of all, let's look at some data to put this into context. Professor Corey Keyes at Emory University has done some research that backs up what we're seeing from the US, backs up what we're seeing here in Australia currently, that around 1 in 5 of us have poor mental health. Now, this is a state in which I spent more than a decade of my life. My emotions often held me hostage. Shame, fear, sadness, anger and hopelessness often directed many of my behaviours. And in that particular state, I found that physical exercise was my escape. The upside to that was that it was a pretty socially acceptable way of coping and, to a point, a healthy coping strategy. The downside to that was that if I couldn't make it to the gym for any reason, I would emotionally spiral out of control. I was out of balance because I was exercising my body, but not my brain. Fortunately, I started to work with a great psychologist, and she taught me how to process my thoughts and my emotions differently. But I couldn't help but wonder why I hadn't been taught these strategies somewhere else before, maybe even as a way of preventing my mood disorders coming on in the first place. Nonetheless, I made the shift from mental illness to mental health. The state of moderate mental health describes about 65% of our population. Most people are doing okay, but not great. They might be doing some mental exercise, maybe not a lot. Now, for some people, we work to get to mental health. Others are lucky to land there, like being born with all of our fingers and toes and a functioning body. Some of us have the fortune to have the circumstances and the genetics to be mentally healthy. This doesn't mean that these people are the fittest of the species. So there's a third category of psychological functioning which I call mental fitness. It takes work to get here, and it takes work to stay here. Professor Corey Keyes estimates that around 18% of us are in this category that he calls flourishing. Now, in my experience, I've noticed that there are certain strategies that we can do, but not one strategy that suits everybody all of the time. I've worked as a group fitness instructor for 16 years. I worked as a physiotherapist for 10 years, and I'm now a mental fitness educator with 2 psychology qualifications. So there are some really important lessons that I have learnt about exercising both the body and the brain, and I see many opportunities and reasons for exercising them together. There are multiple ways that we can do this, and one of the ways is through strength training. Now, if we're talking about exercising our muscles, many of you might think of lifting weights. There's also some psychological lifting that we can do when we need to build our mental fitness. So let's talk about mental strength. One way we can develop our mental strength, particularly in the face of resistance, is particularly when you're thinking about being challenged morally, or if you're feeling pressure to fit into a particular situation, is to look at ways you can develop your character through cultivating self-awareness and then expressing yourself authentically. What this might look like in a group fitness situation might, for instance, be doing an exercise that suits you, taking an option, doing it your way, rather than following the herd and what the other 30 people in the room are doing. However, training for strength is not enough, because otherwise we just become rigid. We also need to train for mental flexibility. The strategies around mental flexibility might look like cultivating creativity, being compassionate toward yourself as well as to other people, harnessing your intuition, not just your analytical thinking. And what this might look like in a sports setting, for example, it could describe a player who does things a little bit differently. Maybe they take a creative or unorthodox approach that takes their opponent by surprise. Or it might be about letting go of unhelpful perfectionism by cultivating mental exercises around self-compassion, meaning that then you can learn from your mistakes rather than being paralysed by them. Now, balancing strength and flexibility is important, but it's also important to consider endurance, because we don't just need to do something once. We often need to stay in there for the long haul, play the long game. The strategies associated with building our endurance might be knowing our values, what's really important to us. It might be about practicing stillness in the form of mindfulness or rest. And maybe it's about a positive mindset. As a physiotherapist, I used to set home exercise programs for people. And one thing that I noticed was that people were far more likely to stick with that program if they had a strong why behind it, if it was connected to a value that was important for them. So what are your top 3 values? And how might your exercise regime help to uphold those? See if you can make the link and notice what happens to your motivation levels. So what, how, and where do we begin when we leave here today? My first suggestion, I invite you to consider changing the conversations you're having, both with yourself and with other people. Rather than saying, I give up, I can't do this, can you change your self-talk to be, I can't do this yet? Rather than complaining about how sore your body is from your training session, can you celebrate how grateful you are for what your body's been able to do for you? And rather than talking about mental health, can we start to talk in terms of mental fitness? Maybe this will help to change some of the stigma still associated with working on our psychological well-being and create a mental fitness movement that is both more empowering and more accessible. My second suggestion is to start to think about challenging our exercise professionals to be more and to do more. Can we start to encourage our sports therapists, our exercise coaches, our physiotherapists, exercise physiologists, to learn basic psychology skills? Not to the extent that they start to push into the scope of counselling, but to the extent where they now have the basic foundational skills in self-care to pass on to others. If we can introduce mental fitness training into every certificate, diploma and degree course where graduates are going to be helping others with their health, not only will that start to take those life skills out of the psychologist's office and empower our people, it will help our graduates to feel more fulfilled, that they're making the difference that they want to be making. And it can take pressure off our struggling healthcare system by providing an easily accessible vehicle for preventive mental health. Lastly, and importantly, don't wait until you're in crisis to start working on your mental fitness. We don't wait until grand final day to take our first ever shot at a goal. We practice, we train in preparation. And the same goes for our psychological health, for ourselves, in our homes, in our businesses, and in our schools. Start cultivating mindfulness. Start using gratitude. Harness your intuition. Express your values. Whether it's mental strength, flexibility, or endurance that you need to focus on, start exercising your mental muscles today, and may we all be fitter tomorrow.